Mental Maps is brought to you by Well. Well is a virtual holistic mental health service, providing psychiatric evaluations, holistic interventions, and when needed, medication management. For more information, check out Well at www.arukawell.co. That's www.arukawell.co. Welcome back to Mental Maps. As always, I hope this finds you well no matter what season of life you're in. Today, we're jumping back into our discussion on minerals. If you just stumbled across this show, or maybe you're kind of jumping in midway through, we started a journey about minerals and what their impact is on brain health a couple weeks ago as we talked about magnesium. And so I highly recommend you go check that out. You don't have to listen to that before you listen to this. However, a lot of the discussion we're going to have about our mineral today is also going to go along with what we talked about a couple weeks ago. So I highly recommend you check those both out because these minerals play well together. And that mineral today is zinc. And so today we're going to jump into the world of zinc and talk about how it really impacts overall brain health, not only from a preventative standpoint, but also from maybe a healing standpoint for people who are feeling really unwell. So let's just go ahead and jump in. Time is always of the essence, right? So in the world of zinc, zinc is a mineral. We see it a lot in our foods. We'll talk about what foods are in, and it's a pretty important mineral. We see it to be wildly abundant in our body. It's actually the most abundant element in our body behind iron, and we know all the love that iron gets, right? And so we believe that there's about 2 to 3 milligrams of zinc already in our bodies, right? That's what the normal level would be. And we see where zinc is primarily in our brain, which is kind of interesting. There's really high concentrations in certain areas of the brain, primarily in areas that are really emotion drive centers, right? Meaning places like the amygdala or the hippocampus or the cortex. And that can sound very sciencey if you're not in the science world. All that's meaning is that those centers are really implicated in emotion and thought and being able to consolidate all of those things. So we know that zinc is really involved in memory. It's involved in learning. It's involved in emotion. And we also believe that in itself, zinc is an antioxidant. And so we know there's a lot of discussion now about the concept of oxidative stress and what that looks like for forming mental illness. There's even discussions about oxidative stress for mothers, right? And what that does to the fetus and then the growing child and the developing brain. So we believe that zinc in itself is an antioxidant, right? And so you may be saying, well, like, what is zinc doing in the brain? Right? Like when we think of vitamins and minerals, we think of different things. What is zinc doing? Zinc is kind of interesting because it really has 2 major actions. The first is on a neurotransmitter called glutamate. If you've been with us for a little bit, you know, we talk a lot about glutamate because glutamate is a really important neurotransmitter in our brain. It's a very excitable neurotransmitter, right? And so we believe that in many issues like depression and anxiety, certain parts of psychosis, glutamate is a factor because glutamate has an impact on GABA and in other neurotransmitters. And so we believe that in itself, zinc is an antagonist or blocks or a modulator to a receptor called NMDA. Once again, if you were already listening to magnesium, you're like, this kind of sounds very similar. And to a point it is because zinc and magnesium do very similar actions at the NMDA receptors. And so we believe that zinc in itself with its antagonism action will calm down the excitability of the brain. Right. And so you may be thinking, well, how is that involved in depression? Hang with me. You've probably already heard it a little bit in magnesium. We'll talk a little bit more about today. But the second thing that zinc does, which is kind of interesting, is it increases something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Once again, I know that sounds really sciencey, and I'm just going to call it BDNF for the rest of the show. But brain-derived neurotrophic factor, to me personally, is one of the most interesting concepts of the brain. And why it's so interesting is BDNF is kind of like miracle grow for your brain. So everything we're doing from kids to adults, we're always making new neural connections, right? Even though our brain, quote unquote, stops developing, right? From like a tissue perspective after 25, we're always creating new neural connections. And we know that brain derived neurotrophic factor really helps us make those neural connections. It kind of speeds up the process. The interesting part about BDNF is that despite it being super helpful to our brain, we really struggle to find ways to increase it, right? We know that about the only tried and true way to let yourself make more BDNF personally is using some kind of like high intensity interval training. There's some pretty good research on that. And really that's kind of about it. But we know zinc in itself as a mineral, it increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor primarily in the hippocampus, as well as some of those other emotion areas that we talked about. So what that means is that these new neural connections, these new thought patterns, these new regulation on emotion, all of these things that you're trying to make in your brain, if zinc is adequate, you can increase the production of it. You can speed it up with your miracle grow because you can increase BDNF, right? We also know that zinc is involved in other concepts, maybe outside of mood in itself, right? It's involved in appetite. It's involved in cognition. It's involved in sleep, right? And we see these actions be through primarily like gut pathways. So once again, as we've talked about, the brain and the gut, they're kind of hand in hand, right? And so many times when we're having actions in the gut, we're having actions in the brain and vice versa. Zinc has affinity to certain places in the gut, and you see it regulate satiety and some of those things. And so what we see in this world of zinc, right, is if your zinc is low, you find yourself having some mood issues, right, as well as maybe some thought issues. We'll talk about that in a minute. And if your zinc is too high, right, it can also be kind of excitotoxic. We talked about that with magnesium, and to a point where people can just consume so much. When I say so much, like an inordinate amount of that mineral, you can become sick. But when we think of low zinc, we're thinking of what we call like hyperexcitable issues, right? Meaning that your depression and your anxiety in itself would be kind of up, right? And so we talked a lot about that on this show before, of the difference between hyper and hypoexcitable. But a perfect example of maybe hyperexcitable depression would be chronic crying spells, racing thoughts, increase in appetite, insomnia. Those are kind of hyperexcitable experiences in depression. Same for anxiety, right? That's your racing thoughts, your nervousness, your shaking, your racing heart, your shortness of breath, that kind of upness, right? We also see where many times both anxiety and depression can have some neurological components with it, right? Where maybe you have like a tremor, or you start having like chronic pain and that kind of stuff. Once again, you see where zinc and magnesium, like we talked about on the previous podcast, can really impact this. And so you may be thinking like, well, how does zinc get low? Well, the easiest way to kind of say that is diet, right? We know that there are certain foods that are really high in zinc. We know that some people may not be consuming those foods or get really inadequate amounts of those foods. And that's really one of the kind of the smoking gun, right? But there's also other ways. And one of the things that's really interesting about zinc is wildly impacted by certain medicines, primarily like antacids and diuretics. We know that hormones, anti-inflammatories like your NSAIDs, they all impact the absorption of zinc, right? Which is really interesting. So you take this antacid every day, right? Because you have chronic heartburn or whatever that looks like. And then you find that the zinc level will be really low because it's impairing the ability for your gut to absorb that zinc that you're consuming from your food. So just because your diet's on point doesn't mean everything else is okay. And I think that's something that's really, really important in that, right? And so we do see, and there's really good research across the board throughout many years of looking at this, where zinc and depression has kind of a pretty close connection. We see where there's low zinc in people diagnosed with major depressive disorder, to the point that there was a study done in 2013 that found a certain level, right? They found that when zinc was at 1.8 micromolar or less, depressive symptoms were present in that person, right? And that's kind of wild. That's not to say that every human being that had that level was going to be depressed, but there was definitely a correlation between that level and lower and the presence of those depressive symptoms that we talked about, right? We also know that outside of depression and outside of maybe even the mood component, we see where the concept of psychosis is really implicated in the world of zinc, right? You may think like, what is that? The hearing things, the seeing things, the believing of things that aren't real, right? And which is just a debilitating illness that medicine really struggles to manage, to be honest with you. And so within that, there's been some really interesting studies about how zinc is kind of related into that world. There's a study that they done post-mortem, right? Meaning people who had psychotic disorders, studying their brains after they've passed away. And they found that about 30 to 50% decrease in overall zinc in the brain was present in these people that died. And they didn't die of their psychosis, but they died. And so that's a really interesting concept that didn't matter what they died from. These people had low amounts of zinc. And that's really important when we think about how debilitating that illness is, because one of the things that the medicines that we use in that world does is primarily affect one specific neurotransmitter, right? And there's a big discussion in this world now that there are many other neurotransmitters that could be implicated. One of them being glutamate, which what does zinc do? It modulates glutamate. So it would make sense that if I don't have good amounts of zinc, I'm not modulating glutamate, which then leads to those symptoms, right? And so just to kind of say like, well, if I've got this problem, right? Like, what do you do? Like, how do you impact it? Well, first and foremost, and we always say it on the show, get your food right. And one of the big things you see in the world of zinc is if you eat meat, meat is the best way to get it, right? Your grass-fed red meats, your poultry, your fish, oysters, all are super high in zinc, right? And it's really readily available. You can consume that in those ways when you eat it. You don't have to have a ton of those meats to get the zinc you need. We also see where dairy is involved in that. If you're not a big meat eater, maybe that's part of your like day-to-day rhythm. We see where there are certain, like leafy greens that can have a little bit of zinc in it. We also see it in like quinoa, some of those things, but you just need a large amount of them to really get the zinc that you're needing day to day. And so for many of those people, supplementing can be helpful, but even if you're consuming those foods, supplementation is really important. We found that just supplementing alone, right? Taking a zinc supplement can decrease your risk of depression by around 28%, all cause, right? It's kind of incredible to think that this supplement that you're taking, that's a mineral that comes from food, can decrease your risk of depression by up to 28%. It's kind of wild, right? And so if you decide to go down the supplement world, you may be thinking, well, what do I do? Right? One of the things that we've talked a lot about on this show, and I know that's out on social media, we talk about as well, is there is a lot of stuff out there. Right. And so if you go to the store, you're walking down the aisle, it's like, what are these things? Right? Like, what is the best to do? And so I think the best thing we can do is really understand what are these minerals and what's present in your mineral that you're getting, right? That multivitamin, the multimineral concept. And so we'll kind of work through that because very similar to magnesium, there's numerous different ones. First and foremost, it's very similar to like what we talked about with magnesium, where you have the mineral and you have a binder with it, right? And that binder theoretically makes it easier to absorb in certain places. And just like we've seen where in magnesium, there are certain forms that are better indicated for the brain. There's certain forms that are better indicated for the gut and vice versa. The one you see the most used, I would say, especially in the world of like supplementation and those kind of things, is something called zinc biglycinate, right? And so that's just zinc and glycine. You heard us talk about glycine in the magnesium where you have magnesium glycinate. Zinc biglycinate is just zinc and the amino acid glycine. And to a point, it makes it really easy to absorb. It's really easy on the gut, just like how magnesiums can be kind of hard on the gut, zinc can too. We know that biglycinate in itself just makes it a little bit easier absorbed. And that's pretty present in a lot of the minerals that you'll find. You may also find, though, that there's a zinc orotate, right? And that's just zinc and orotate salt. Orotate salt is just a good binder. It helps it go across the blood-brain barrier a little bit easier, right? We've talked about orotate before in the world of lithium. If you haven't listened to that show yet, definitely go check that out as we talk about their binders. Orotate makes it just a little bit easier to cross the blood-brain barrier. And to a point, in the world of mental health, I really prefer the zinc orotate. It's really well absorbed. We know it's neuroprotective. It gets where it needs to go pretty easily. And that's the one that I recommend to people the most, right? The other one that you see in the world of mental health, there's many other zinc in their binders. The other one you'll see in the world of mental health is zinc picolinate, right? Or zinc and picolinic acid. You may think, well, what is that? And how is that important for the brain? Well, picolinic acid is derived from something called tryptophan. And if you've been with us for a little bit, what is tryptophan involved in? It's involved in the creating of serotonin, right? We know that tryptophan makes what's called 5-HTP, and then 5-HTP then makes serotonin, right? And so we know that this picolinic acid is derived from the same precursor of serotonin, right? So clearly, this would be something that would play well together. You may see it used a lot. It's not used a ton, but you may find it, especially in like some neurotropic kind of supplements or kind of micro blends, that kind of stuff. Lastly, and probably the zinc that everybody's very well aware of is zinc oxide. This is not good. This is the zinc that's in your sunscreen. This is incredible for sunscreen. It's the sunscreen that my wife and I use. I'm a big believer in just using the zinc, even though sometimes you may look like a mime walking around the beach. It's way better than getting super sunburn if you choose to use sunscreen. And zinc is the best way to go about it. And zinc oxide is what we're using. However, zinc oxide is not very well absorbed on the inside of our bodies. So if you're out of zinc, don't go pick up your sunscreen and start like taking a tablespoon of it, because that will not work. The zinc oxide will not get to your brain like we need it to. So for your skin, zinc oxide, very good. For your brain, zinc orotate, zinc biglycinate, or the zinc picolinate, which all three can be very helpful. I recommend the zinc orotate if you're going to go down that route. And so if you decide to do zinc, you may be thinking like, how much do I do? And I think that can be kind of unknown for a lot of people because the dose range is pretty high, right? In America, the recommended intake is between 6.5 milligrams and 25 milligrams. That's a big difference, right? Max of zinc is around 40 milligrams. That's about the max that's been studied. We see where the recommended intake needs to be around 20 to 25. I would say if you're on that low level and you feel great, more power to you. But even if you fall between like that 6.5, 10, even 12 to 15, and you're not feeling good, that doesn't mean your zinc's where it needs to be, right? So you definitely need to elevate that up. And so you know what that looks like from a supplement is taken anywhere between 15 and 50 milligrams. It's been studied very high, all the way up to like 200 plus milligrams. We see it to be the most effective in the world of psychosis with that. There's a really cool study that was done in 2015 where they took a dopamine antagonist or an antipsychotic known as risperidone. They put it with zinc and they found better outcomes when they put that 200 plus milligram supplement of zinc on board, right? I'm a big believer recommended between 15 and 20 milligrams to start. If you're not feeling any improvement in a couple of weeks, go ahead and get it up to that 40 or that 50 milligram, whatever you're feeling comfortable with, whatever your body's responding to. Now, you may be listening to this and thinking, didn't you just say the recommended intake is 20 milligrams? And if you're following, that is correct. One of the things about a supplement is just because it says it's got 50 milligrams in it, doesn't mean that's 50 milligrams of zinc orotate itself, right? And even the back of the bottles will show you that. So it may say 50 milligrams of zinc, which is the equivalent of 15 milligrams of, or 50 milligrams of zinc orotate, 15 milligrams of zinc, right? It's all it's saying is there's 50, many times all it's saying is it's 50 milligrams of it together, right? That's what it's measured as. But in that measurement, there's this much zinc in it, right? So just be aware of that too. But I would recommend starting anywhere between 15 to 20 milligrams. 20 is kind of the easiest way to start, and then go up after a month if you need to, right? So to a point, this is zinc. You know, it's a really cool mineral. I think it's a mineral that I use a lot in my clinical practice for people because many people just aren't consuming the amount of food that they need. And even if they are, maybe they're impacting the absorption of it. And so I'm a big believer in putting zinc and magnesium together. They play really well together. They even magnify one another. And so there's something to be said for putting both of those modulators on together. Many people take these at nighttime. And the reason for that is they can just be calming. Remember, I said that this is really good for hyperexcitability, right? And so it's really good to take it at nighttime. I know some people who don't find the tiredness with it. And if so, take it in the daytime. And you may even see some blends that tell you to take it in the daytime. But I like taking magnesium and zinc at night. I think it works really well. And so if you find yourself being kind of up, right, or hyperexcitable, whether that's hyperexcitable sadness, hyperexcitable anger, hyperexcitable anxiety, or even hyperexcitable thought, right, hearing things, seeing things, that kind of stuff, the concept of zinc could be wildly helpful to you, right? So I definitely recommend if you're in that place, give it a shot. Now, ultimately, as I said in magnesium, we know one of the most concrete ways to know if your zinc's off is getting it tested, right? You can always work with integrative providers that can do that, and functional health providers, there's many out there, but also recognize that can cost a lot of money, right? And so to a point, experiment with your zinc, making sure it comes from a good company may be a good way to do that. Just be very aware that you can't get too much of it and being very aware of what your body's responding to. So that's zinc. Thanks for kind of walking this journey with me in the world of minerals. You know, so we've got magnesium, we got zinc. We're going to keep moving on with these handful of minerals that are wildly important to the brain. If you got questions or you want to connect with us, reach out on social media. You know, we're really involved with Ruka Well social media on Instagram. and on LinkedIn. And so if that's something you want to be involved in with us, just, man, add us, talk to us. We'd love to know what you're thinking. If you got questions, and, man, if you're finding the upness, magnesium and zinc. Have a great day, guys.